Good morning and welcome to today's conversation at Brookings Global. I'm Tony Pipa. I'm a senior fellow in global economy and development at the Brookings Institution. And today's edition of Global Conversations at Brookings Global is the next installment of a series of fireside chats that I've been having with city leaders who are on the front lines of the COVID-19 pandemic and are also dealing with the implications of inequality and racial injustice and other issues as they deal with the pandemic and think about recovery. We're particularly interested in this series and how cities and local leaders are committing themselves to build back better, using the issues and guidelines and focus on equity and sustainability. And I'm really pleased to welcome today Mayor Marvin Rees of the city of Bristol in the United Kingdom. If you're tuning in through Zoom, we do have the chat open, so I'm happy to entertain your questions as our conversation progresses. I just want to remind everyone to remain civil and constructive with your suggestions and your comments. You can also be tuning in live via the Twitter feed at Brookings Global, and if you have questions via that, please just post them on our Twitter feed. So Mayor, welcome. Thanks very much for setting aside some time. I know it's a busy time these days. Bristol is the 8th largest metro area in the UK, and you were elected in 2016. You're the first mayor of Black African heritage, actually, of a major European city. So before we even get started and get into what's actually happening today in the city, because there are different governance structures and ways in which cities work around the world, just tell us a little bit about what are your role and responsibilities as the mayor of Bristol? And as you became mayor, what were your major priorities and themes as you've been mayor and throughout your tenure?
So my role sits within the local authority, the city government, and historically that's all that political leadership position has been. Historically, the political leader has been chosen by the political party, by those councillors amongst themselves. They would choose the political leader. But with the introduction of a mayor, it's directly elected by the city. So it maintains that political responsibility to local government, but now there's a direct relationship with the wider city as well. So it expands the role out there. So I see it in many ways. Clearly, there's a hierarchical relationship within the local authority, but the fullness of the role is not through command and control, it's through convene and ask. Because I'm working with our universities, our business sector, the police service, the health services, voluntary sector, faith groups, people of which I have no organizational control or influence. So it's about the ability to bring people together. And my priorities in coming in, I had a kind of a structural and an issue priority. I felt that one of the things that the city always lacked was a long-term plan. We were basically planning on a 1, 2, 3 year horizon. That's no way to run a city of 500,000 people. So I wanted us to work on developing a long-term plan as a city, not as a local government, as a city. And we can share more about that. And my priority was on inclusion, poverty and inequality. We're a city with a fantastic story to tell to the outside world. 2-class universities, a third of the world's natural history broadcasting, a digital center, thriving finance. But nearly a quarter of our children growing up in income-deprived households, 20% of our children at risk of hunger. And I wanted to get on top of that, alongside delivering what I call the environmental justice as well.
Well, I hope we talk more about that, because you just honed in on two major issues there, one on the environmental side, but then the other on poverty and inequality and injustice. And balancing those two has to be, it has to be challenging, but also I think provides lots of opportunities. But it's interesting, you just talked about governance in different ways, that you have a formal role with the city and within city council, but you're also convener, someone who's actually building partnerships and building relationships outside of city government. So before COVID, and you talked about actually wanting to have a strategy, a long-term strategy and plan for the city. So before COVID, you led the city through a process to create what Bristol calls the One City Plan. Tell us a bit about how you approach this, how you engage those other stakeholders that you were just talking about, and what it meant to City Council and to your administration. And also be good to talk a little bit about how those issues of inequality and sustainability also played into that as you developed that strategy.
Sure. So I will say that actually some of the inspiration came from stateside, actually, the old Chicago plans, 50-year plans, and then a New York plan as well. And I've got a copy on the shelf behind me. So we saw that there was precedent for a city to begin working together to think about where it wanted to be in 10, 20, 30, 40 years time. So it begins with a shared understanding of the challenge we were taking on and what a city is. And we had two kind of foundational understandings that I wanted to share with the city. The first is that what people get from any city is not the result of the decisions made by any single organization, but they sit at the intersection of decisions made by the whole suite of organizations. So I don't have levers in City Hall that I pull and get outcomes on mental health. Mental health depends on what we do, but it also depends on the quality of employment, transport, poverty, access to quality food, education experience. There are levers in organizations over which I have no control. So that if we're serious about building a place for people, we will begin to work as though that's the way cities work. The other is our interdependence as organizations. So our success as a local authority depends on the mental health of our population, for example. The resilience of the workforce that the private sector depend on will depend on the mental health of the workforce. So we have a shared interest there. They have an interest in us doing early intervention in families' lives to build that well-being and resilience in our young people. So when we begin working with our independencies, that formed the confirmation that we were asking the right question and we were taking on the right challenge. Once we agreed on what the challenge was, that gave us the kind of authority to push down this track. And it's what I call, I think I just shared with it just now, the movement from local government to city governance. So no longer was it simply about Bristol, about the local council, it was about us and how we work together to create the space. Then when we did our initial analysis, what I called the three chaos that we had live in the city when we began to map it out, we had a chaos of strategies in Bristol. So every organization had a whole bunch of strategies. In the council, we had about 300. We had over 500. Yeah, we had 500 strategies live in the city. At best they weren't talking to each other. At worst they were conflicting. But actually, we mapped them against a timeline. Most of them finished this was in 2017. Most of them finished in 2021, 2022. So we weren't planning beyond 2022 as a city. There were a few things out there, but nothing of substance. The other was a chaos of metrics. There were about 1,500 metrics live in Bristol at that time. 1,500 things against which we're measuring ourselves. Again, you couldn't run an organization like that. So why would you try and run a city like that? And the third chaos was a chaos of sovereignty. So there were boards and decision-making parts all over the place, not talking to each other, maybe crossing over on housing, on education, but no communication. And our initial task was begin to map that and organize it. And we haven't finished that job, but we're a lot further on than when we were at the beginning. And those are the challenges that we took on. And then together, over a period of time, we began to agree what we wanted to get done. First of all, we agreed how we wanted to be able to describe Bristol in 2050. And then we said, okay, well, what is everything we need to do in the intervening years to be that city? So what do we need to have done, achieved, and delivered by 2048, 2042, 2039, 2036, right back up to 2018. And we set back. That was a really challenging task, but it's the one we took on. And, we came up with an imperfect plan. And that's what we say. It's not perfect. It's in constant review.
We'll talk a little bit about how you're structured. And it's interesting how you talked about this. You went from city council to governance, to city governance as well, with other stakeholders in the city, with the private sector, with the universities, with civil society. Talk about how you're organized, how the plan helped you organize those different stakeholders as well, and the structures that you put in place through that process.
So I'm going to share something that's not very scientific, but I basically sat at my desk and I was just drawing, and I thought to myself, literally what we wanted was a literal timeline. We do not want a 500-page strategy, right? We wanted an actual timeline, 2018, 2019. And then I thought, what are the component parts of the city's single story? And I came up with 6: housing, communities, education and skills, transport and connectivity, health and well-being, economy and environment. Just 6, because part of the discipline was about choosing what you're not going to focus on and not talking about, because if you try and do 1,001 things, you won't do anything, right? So we just narrowed it down to those 6. Then we set up boards under each of those headings. Some boards already existing in one form or another, but we set up each board, and each board had the job, and these boards were made up of local government, private sector, voluntary sector, faith groups, the different public sector organizations like us, the health service, so a mix of people. Each board was given the responsibility for coming up with 3 aims for every year up to 2050. Not 4 aims, not 5, not 2, you're gonna have 3. And you had to sequence them. So the idea is that actually the things you do in 2018 should make 2022 more likely to be successful, the things you put in 2022. And that was a challenge for people. So first off, when I gave it to some of my team to begin working on it, I gave them 6 strands, six boards, and they came back with 11. Because everyone wants their own board, right? What about this? What about culture? What about, I want my board. We're important too. We say, no, 6 boards, right? Because we've had a chaos of sovereignty. If you want to set up another board, it's fine, but you have to make the link between that board and one of the 6 overarching boards, right? So we begin to drive some structure in. And also, when we gave people blank timelines about what they thought the city should be doing, basically they put a list of 25 things in year 1, and we say, no, you got to sequence it, right? You have to tell me what you're prepared to deprioritize to have a priority. And that was hard for people, but we went down that route and managed to get there in the end. But what we've been clear at the beginning in our One City plan, we say on page 1, we've got a list of what it is and what it isn't. And this has been very helpful. What it is not is perfect. What it is not is complete. What it is not is a plan to usurp all plans, and it will not tell you what you need to do tomorrow. What it is an effort to organize ourselves, to rally us around a shared vision, to put our ambitions in sequence and be intentional about what we do. And what we've also said is, we refresh the plan every year. So like a friend of mine is in the army, he says, make a plan, any plan, just make a bloody plan, right? Just get it written down. It's not perfect, and then we'll change it. And when we get to 2025, we'll look back at the 2018 iteration and we'll say to ourselves, that was a really unsophisticated plan. But we build on the sophistication by constantly rewriting it as we go.
And how did the Sustainable Development Goals and the idea of sustainability and sustainable development, where did that intersect with the plan? How was that a potential, where was the value of that to the plan as well? How did that guide it?
So that was an interesting relationship. So I come from a development background, so I was aware of the SDGs, but I didn't have them at the forefront of my mind when I was elected. Now we had a secondee. Again, the way the city office, so for the One City plan, we set up a city office whereby we get organizations in the city to second people in to the city office for periods of time to help us write this plan. So it's not written by council officers, it's written by us. But one of the people who joined the city office is a guy called Alan McLeod, and his expertise from the University of Bristol is on the SDGs. So we just said, oh, someone says Alan's great. we just said, why don't we check this plan against the SDGs so we can test the extent to which we are actually planning to deliver the SDGs, what we're going to do, and we can tell people what we are contributing. So we did that job, and Alan did some fantastic work and began to, basically just put the SDGs in the One City plan as a, visual representation of when people read the plan, they came across them. But we've begun moving that recently and become much more assertive. And our next iteration will not just talk about how we happen to map against the SDGs. We are now going to start saying, let's build a plan that delivers the SDGs. So the SDGs become the explicit aim of what we are trying to do with our political economy and our one city plan. And Alan's at the heart of that. In fact, online, if you visit the One City Plan, you can search all those outcomes that are listed, the 6 boards having 3 outcomes every year up to 2050. You can click on an SDG and it will bring up the list of every outcome in their year that delivers that SDG. So you can begin to search our One City Plan by the SDGs now.
So looking forward, you know, go through this process, engaging lots of different parts of the city, even creating those structure of those boards, and then the 3 priorities each year that the 3 sprints each year that each board is going to go after. Then COVID hits, right? So before we get into that, just let us tell us a little bit about where Bristol is now in the trajectory of the COVID-19 pandemic, and what you've been doing as a city, and where the city has been in the response to that. And then let's talk about how COVID also is, you know, affecting what you had put in place even before the pandemic came across.
So we as a region, and we're trying to work out why, have not been as badly impacted by COVID as the rest of the country. Actually, the West, Bristol and the Southwest has had pretty low numbers. Like between July 15th and July 22nd, for example, we had 5 new cases.
Wow.
Yeah, in the city. Now, testing is not universal, so there'll be more cases out there. But on our what we call our Pillar 1, Pillar 2 data, which is tests done by the National Health Service and then tests in the community, we've just registered 5 new cases, and overall about 1,300 cases in Bristol since the crisis began. But it has impacted on us. The way I describe COVID in and of itself is a threat to health. But actually the measures we are taking to manage COVID are a threat to health because of the unemployment and the inequality and the lockdown and all that.
Right.
So we're very much seeing the legacy of COVID is going to come through those social impacts, the social determinants of health and society. Right. And you know, when we have an aerospace industry here, that's a major employer that's under huge threat because of what's happened to the sector. We're a big tourist and a big nighttime economy. City, lots of food, and so those are taking a huge hit right now as well, and that's where we're going to see the real impact. But I will say that we were able to really reorient those structures and relationships we put in place, and I do emphasize we built structures, but through the One City Plan we built relationships, and it's that soft network of trust and relationships that we built that put us in good stead. So as soon as the crisis kicked off, we repurposed a couple of our existing boards. So the economy board that had been meeting quarterly, trying to shape the city's future and the One City Plan, started to meet weekly. And they took on the challenge, three headings: survival, recovery, back to flourishing. So they took on that challenge straight away. We had people obviously we had public sector, private sector, creative, within that, finance, the whole remit, the Chamber of Commerce, all working together on those 3 aims. That got us ahead of the game in terms of our preparedness and our ability to talk to the city about the proactive measures we were taking, give them confidence that we were there. We also used to have a leaders' breakfast, myself, the university chancellors, Chamber of Commerce, the head of police, head of the bus company. And as soon as the COVID hit, we used to have breakfast once a quarter. We upped that to weekly meetings, and I actually had that meeting today, 1 hour, just check in for an hour, and we just talk to each other. And again, it's the soft conversations. I know you've got an issue in adult social care. I know you've got an issue on your bus service, and we just know about what's going on. We can pick up the phone outside. So we repurposed that to really get the city working together. And we placed a heavy emphasis on the most vulnerable people. That was our purpose. So we launched a very successful citywide feeding program for people that weren't able to access food during the lockdown, for example. And that's something that a lot of people have had a lot of interest in.
Well, continue to talk about that as you talk about recovery. So I think it's really, I think that's an important lesson, what you just talked about, that soft, those soft relationships and power, because that really, to me, sounds as if it extends from all the work that you were doing even pre-COVID in engaging different parts of the city and creating the structure of those boards and the engagement that you were having with other city leaders from other sectors as well as just citizens. So I think that's that's really an important lesson. But talk about, because you also talked about, one of the priorities, even as you came in for your tenure, was a focus on inequality. And you just talked about one of the priorities in your response is for those who are most vulnerable and affected the most from the economic fallout. How is that informing your thinking about recovery? Like what are some examples of how you're going to have to now combine recovery and even flourishing, as you said, with also addressing issues of inequality? Because I know, pre-COVID, Bristol was one of the wealthiest places in the UK, but also had some of the deepest poverty, had pockets of really deep poverty as well.
Yeah, out of over 300 local authority areas, we're allegedly the 7th worst city to be black in. So we have this phenomenal wealth. We are one of the worst cities to be born poor in. We have a constituency here in Bristol West that has among the highest numbers of young people going into higher education. In Bristol South, we have among one of the lowest numbers of young people going on to higher education. Interestingly, wow. Bristol South has traditionally been a very white part of the city. For want of a better way, white working class left behind. So, real deprivation. There's deprivation in the north as well, but there's more racial mixing in the north, but the inequalities are there. So I see a real dilemma, a real challenge facing us now, particularly as the economy downturns for those of us interested in inclusion. It's this, that that economic downturn is going to hit the poorest hardest, isn't it? It's going to hit the most marginalized hardest. So they'll pay a big price for it. But then when the economy begins to move again, they're going to be least well placed to take advantage of that moving. So I anticipate we will see a compounding of inequalities over the coming years. And while even if they say, I've heard predictions now that we are going to have a V-shaped economic recovery in the UK, our social recovery would not be V-shaped. You don't just bounce back off all that loss, right? Will it be loss of jobs, loss of homes, loss of relationships, loss of time in school? So we are trying to do the work now about preparing for the skills transfers that are needed. We had a conversation today about the large number of jobs in the care sector that cannot be filled, but people losing their jobs in other sectors, at the same time. But we also need to address terms and conditions in care. They're low status jobs, often low paid, poor conditions. So we want to take on challenges of how we redress that. But in our economic recovery statement of intent that was produced, like I say, very quickly after the downturn, what is fantastic is that ourselves, business, other public sector organizations are stating very clearly that our economic recovery has to be built for the SDGs. It has to be built on inclusion and sustainability. And making those kinds of statements is the first step, really, rather than us chasing up. So we want a values-based economic recovery. And I see a real danger in a dash to growth off the back of it that eschews all values, goes for the big macro numbers, and misses the fact that economic recovery will be very, very hollow. The danger of that hollowness is it will sow in social instability that will end up eating economic development and stitching the destruction of the planet. So we're trying to make sure we get ahead of all those. I don't know what the answer is. To be honest, it's not on the back of a fag packet, is it? But we have minds thinking about that, and I'll work with other cities around the world through the Mayor's Migration Council. We're not a member of C40, but we associate with C40. We're hopefully going to share that with other cities as well.
So as we think about, as you talk about this, and I see some questions coming up in the chat, is the inequality also intersect with race in Bristol? And as even the implications and the impacts of COVID, has that intersected with race? Is there bigger impacts in the Black and brown communities than there are in the white communities? That's what we're experiencing here in the US.
Yeah,
so just
it's exactly the same here. Disproportionate impact on Black and brown people, but obviously it's about poverty too. So overcrowded housing. I got very wary when people started to look at genetic differences. I mean, there's more genetic variation between the continent, people who are born on the continent of Africa than there is between some white, and I'm mixed heritage myself, you know. So yeah, social conditions, people disproportionately on frontline jobs, pre-existing health conditions, you know, like respiratory problems, asthma for where people live. But when I talk about race, I always talk about class at the same time. They're not the same thing, but they're inseparable. And poor white people are also disproportionately in those frontline jobs, in those poor conditions. So we have to talk about both at the same time without using one to eclipse the other.
But it's interesting, there's also, because you were talking about addressing that, you have to think about it through two different dimensions. One is the quality of the jobs themselves. How well do the jobs actually provide the benefits and the quality of living itself through its income, through benefits, through other things. And then the other is, how do you get people into those jobs? How do you do the reskilling? How do you do the outreach?
Yes.
How do you ensure that people get in there? And but to your point, it's really interesting that the work that you even did pre-COVID gave you a platform to very quickly get everybody on the same page and say, this is our commitment. This is what we're signing up to. This is what we're actually going to be attentive to and intentional about as we think about the decisions we have to make going forward. So let's shift a little bit, because I also know Bristol's got quite a reputation around issues of sustainability and environmental sustainability is when I use that term. Green European Capital, I think in 2015, and you all had actually just, I think, launched a climate strategy at the beginning of the year before the pandemic really rippled through and unfolded. So how has COVID and what's happened now and the way you're thinking about recovery, how has it affected those plans? And how are there ways in which you've been trying to connect the plan around making, tackling things like climate change with sort of the economic inequality and the things that you're trying to do to address that? Like, how do those come together, if at all?
So it forms part of a sometimes tense relationship I've had with the environmental movement, actually, how we reframe that conversation. Because I heard too often, activists just saying, well, we just have to pay a bit more, and that's the price we have to pay. You know, but the problem is they've got the money to pay a little bit more. The issue is, if you want to live a low impact life, often when it's dominated by the white middle class and doesn't include the white working class or poor people with black and brown skin, then you know they're talking in abstracts to those people. If your number one priority is my child going to get stabbed? You know, are they going to go to prison? Can I put food on the table today and tomorrow? You know, you're less emotional and economic space to think about existential threats in 25 years' time. You're just thinking about survival. I think there was a lack of understanding or even empathy sometimes in the environmental movement to take that seriously. I think the argument, I said this to Extinction Rebellion, you know, going along to someone and saying, I know you've got life problems, but I've got a bigger one and I want you to take it on, is no way to build a movement, right? You have to say, I'm going to respect where you are and respect the fact that this is your number one priority. Let me help you solve that and earn the right to speak into people's lives. So we had to go through a bit of a journey on that without that challenge being heard as an effort to undermine the environmental movement. Rather, it being understood as an effort to strengthen the environmental movement by making space for more people to be involved in it and give it a true democratic mandate. So we had to work through that. But it has been a challenge. We declared a climate emergency and we've developed a plan to get us to carbon neutrality by 2030. That's not cheap and it's not easy. But we also declared an ecological emergency, which isn't necessarily tackled by the climate emergency, which is the loss of species. We've lost about 98% of some of our bird species in the city since the 1970s, which is frightening to think of. But we're under huge threat on that now. One is local government is in a new normal in the UK. Higher costs of the population because of all the need, lost revenue because of lower taxes being paid, and no government support. So some of the areas that we have to go and find money to meet the crises of today are in those interventions that would give us long-term sustainability. So this is one of our dilemmas. I'm also concerned, the phrase I mentioned earlier on, a dash for growth that becomes values free, it's very dangerous. Our own government is just saying build, build, build. But where are the values in that? Where's the inclusion? Where's the sustainability? And we need values more now than we did before. So we build back properly. In fact, I would say there's an economic benefit to be built in building back better, because we build more resilient cities that are more attractive to investors looking for somewhere to put their money. Right? But the opportunity is that while a huge chunk of the economy has disappeared, when we build it back, we do build back better. And one of the cases I've been making to government is to really front load investment in green infrastructure, decarbonising transport, housing, public buildings and energy, and use that as the economic stimulus. A Green New Deal, you might say, for the UK.
So combining the stimulus and sustainability at the same time, and being attentive to the issues of inequality. So really, what you're suggesting is the importance of looking through multiple lenses at one time and being respectful of the imperatives of each of those lessons. I imagine, actually, I've had my own experience just sort of working in crisis situations, humanitarian emergencies. I did a lot of work in Louisiana and New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. And I can imagine there's a lot of pressure to act fast and like to get economic activity rolling again and to get jobs. But to your point, you also have to take the time to be intentional and make sure that you're achieving the values that you want to have. And I'm sure that's actually quite a dilemma, or you're feeling pressure on both sides to be able to balance that. That must be quite a challenge.
It is, because the need is here right now. I mean, we obviously have a comparatively advanced social safety net. I mean, there are many problems with it, but that is there to support people. But that's where the sustainable development goals, I think, become really important for us. That they are there, they have been thought about, and they offer, a collection of values, I believe, of what we could point at. And the good thing about us is we can do it, and the city can sign up to it, but it gives us a global language to join together with other cities around the world. If we're all speaking the language of the SDGs, that's how they're going to get delivered, but it helps us hopefully facilitate some of that international working. But it is, I mean, the need is right here, right now. My cabinet lead for education is a teacher, and she told me last night that they're shocked at how many children have gone back to school after being out for 8 weeks, and both their parents have lost their jobs. And it's a major change in the household. So we're seeing these changes come back very quickly.
Wow. Well, along the lines of the SDGs, let me just pick up a question that was also in the chat. So can you talk a little bit about how you're, as a city, drawing on evidence and data to think about how that's informing the social recovery, and how the SDGs and other frameworks have actually helped you measure and think about what your interventions need to look like?
I'll be honest on this front. This is an area in which we've been asking for some help with. I was on a seminar with the World Economic Forum just a few weeks ago, and I was just talking about Bristol, and they said, where do you need help? The two areas of help I said we need as local government are around, how do we match our one city plan to the SDGs? Where are the experts in the globe who are, in the top Premier League of strategic planning, putting metrics in place, and also the metrics of interdependence? So if I spend £5 on mental health in 2020, how do we know that impacts on reduced spend in criminal justice system in 2032, right? So we need that expertise made available, because the ravages on local government at the moment have been such that we're basically being stripped back to providing crisis services, right? And there isn't much emotional, even organisational space, or there's less emotional space to think about the future. The other thing I asked them to help actually with was finance. That we need new vehicles of finance. Our national governments are not funding the kind of development we need. They offer us it might be frightening to hear, but they don't offer us financial certainty. But what we need are those big philanthropists, those big investors who are serious about the world not dying and being just, to think of what are the new kind of financial vehicles they can use to partner with cities and global networks of cities to deliver the SDGs, right? If we can plan 10 years, if you give us 10 years of finance, we'll give you a 10-year development plan. If you give us 15 years, 20 years, we'll give you a 20-year plan. And those are the horizons now on which cities need to be working. Our Bristol has grown over the years with no regard to the planet. It's just grown. So if you want to live a low impact life, you have to be intentional. You have to have knowledge, be intentional, and probably have a bit of spare disposable income. We need to rebuild our city systems so that even if you don't think about it, you live in a low impact life. That means rebuilding our cities. That takes money, takes investment. But we're actually going through a series of seminars now with some thinkers about, well, what could those vehicles look like, and how could we link with the big global funders that might partner with us. Sorry, there's a long way around. We with our one city plan, we're putting the metrics around it, doing our best to do so, but it's a real challenge and we need support doing it.
Yeah, and I think I know we at Brookings been working with you and other cities, and that there are other institutions as well, and think tanks and researchers. But the idea of getting down to some metrics that are actually really useful and applicable to you, sort of as someone for performance management, and to be thinking of it in those terms, I think is a challenge. Also because the SDGs were sort of created at the national and global level, right? So they weren't even created with local governments on the metric side in mind. And it's interesting that you talk about finance, because that's also one of the big themes that we're hearing about, is where are the creative financial mechanisms and how to create the partnerships with finance that is not just your national government and the relationship amongst, or your provincial government, the relationships amongst the different levels of public governance, but where are the creative mechanisms. And it's interesting because when we talk to capital asset managers, they actually see this from a risk perspective. It makes a lot of sense. If you're being intentional about things like inequality and environmental sustainability and greening your infrastructure, that it makes a lot of sense for that's what they want to see in investment. So how do we bring those two things together in creative ways, I think is a real opportunity actually coming out of this. Yeah. But it also it's going to have to take place under pressure of a lot of time pressure to sort of get things in place as quickly as possible. I think that's the challenge there. Yeah. Let me move, because we were talking a little bit about inequality and where it intersects with race. You know, here in the United States, we're not only just dealing with the COVID pandemic, but also a lot of focus through Black Lives Matter and through protests coming of the video that surfaced of George Floyd's death. And I know Bristol's had experienced its own protests, and statue of Edward Colston was pulled down and thrown into Bristol's harbor. You know, how do you process and help the community process these issues? Because they must be related to the issues of inequality and poverty that we were talking about earlier as well. And how do we make this movement and help us to go to the next level of what we need to be thinking about in terms of the legacy of race in our societies?
So I would just say, I think one of the first things I set out to do was to make sure that people knew they were understood and respected. So we had, the statue was pulled down. I'm a person of Jamaican heritage. Colston was involved in the transport of over 80,000 Africans, about 19 to 20,000 of whom died on the route. And he may have transported one of my ancestors, right? And made money out of that. So I've no love loss for the statue of a slaver being up in the middle of the city. At the same time, I'm an elected mayor, so I can't condone criminal damage, right? And I have to hold those two things together. So I wanted to be open about that. But at the same time, there was like what some people call a counter rally the week after. And it was a lot of soccer fans turned out to protect the cenotaph, as they described it. And a number of people just described them as far right. And they weren't all far right. There were far right there, but the organizers were not far right. And I went to meet some of those guys, and I've subsequently had phone calls with them. And what's interesting was they were saying to me that we don't care about the statue. And we actually sympathize with Black Lives Matter. but we don't like the way the protest was happening, you know. And interestingly, at the heart of their concern, I said, what is your real concern? And he said, some of our guys feel like they're losing their city. I said, they are losing their city, but they're losing their city to house prices. That's what's going on. And we had a talk, and it was a good talk. And they went on their website and said, look, you know, we talked to the mayor and he understands what's going on. We have to come up with a way of developing processes and ways of leading that if you get what you want, fine. If you don't get what you want, you know you've been heard and respected. And even if you get what you don't want, you know you've been heard and respected, and this is still your city. So we've been on a path of saying, how can we build a city in which we can disagree well, and we can live with difference? Not about pretending we're all the same, you know, we're all the same color, I don't see color and all that kind of nonsense. We are different, and we just got to grow up and find political leaders that create circumstances for us to live with that difference. I think that's one of the arts of modern city making, the ability to live with difference.
Well, and that's the art of discourse and of helping your communities evolve as well. So thank you for that. That's actually, I think, some real lessons there for us to think about what leadership looks like in a situation like that. We only have a couple minutes left, and you've mentioned a couple of ways in which Bristol continues to also engage globally, and sort of the leadership that you talked about, the Global Mayors Migration Council, the Global Parliament of Mayors. Talk a little bit about why you think it's important to be engaging in those sorts of networks. And that would also be good, and just picking up on a question in the chat here, I know that the Global Parliament of Mayors have been advancing a resolution to have urban violence by 2030. You know, so maybe that's an example. How does advancing that goal collectively within something like the Global Parliament of Mayors help you take steps within Bristol to be concrete? And what's the interaction between global and local on issues like that?
So I didn't come in, I'm an internationalist. I mean, I'm, you know, Jamaican heritage, Welsh, Irish, English, and all that sort of stuff. So I've always been quite global, lived in the US for a few numbers of years. My wife is American, brother-in-law Swiss. So I'm always, but I didn't come in with a manifesto that talked about being international as a city. It's just something that becomes, you just need is necessary. Bristol, you know, mayors need not only the power to shape what goes on inside their boundaries, but they need the platform to be able to shape the national and international context in which they have to work. Because all those forces that come from outside, economic changes, migration policy, you know, health policy, these shape what goes on inside our city. So the fullness of that leadership role can only be fulfilled by operating internationally. I'd also just share that it's clear to me on the major challenges of our time that national governments working alone just cannot meet those challenges, and are not meeting them. Climate change, migration, economic stability, it's just broken. It's a broken model. Someone said to me, it's the best model of government you could ask for if it was 1949. You know, we need to move on, and global governance needs to move into its next iteration that includes the leaders of cities and networks of cities as equal partners in shaping national and international policy. We need, national governments are not necessarily going to open up to that so quickly, but we certainly need bodies like the UN and World Bank to begin working as though that is real. And I think cities are, in many ways, where the world needs to be. Cities are post-national. You know, in my city, 180 countries of origin, 92 languages, 45 religions. Defining what it means to be Bristol is not going to be the same as defining what it means to be British. That doesn't mean you're not British, but it just means that cities are better able to cope with multi-dimensional identities. So I just think that it's absolutely essential. It's the machinery of global governance that's a problem at the moment. I mean, on violence, you know, we are chuffed to be a part of the Global Parliament of Mayors. I'm really honoured to be able to join some of the C40 events, and obviously I'm really honoured to be part of the Mayors Migration Council. So for us, linking up with other cities and making that collective case, both to our own governments and international bodies, about what we need in place to be able to deliver is essential. And reducing violence will be about individual perpetrators, but it would also be, we go back to finance, it would be about good quality housing, right? Inclusive economic development, won't it? It would be about reducing climate-driven migration, vulnerable people, that makes people vulnerable. All those peripheral issues that we would identify, you know, along with that as well. But workers working together is absolutely key.
Well,
Sorry,
that
I
brings
mean
us all the way back.
cities working together. My socialist background's there.
Well, that brings us all the way back to your one city plan, though, and the connection of your one city plan to what other cities around the world are doing as well, and finding way to collectively actually work both on those issues together, but also, as you say, raise that voice, that urban voice up within the global governance sphere as well. Listen, we're at time, and it has been a real pleasure. Thank you for a rich conversation. We've covered a lot of ground. We're very impressed with what's happening in Bristol, just in terms of trying to make progress on multiple issues at once around issues of inequality, how it intersects with race and class, as you mentioned, and also continue to stay true to the commitments that you've made around environmental, climate change, and ecological sustainability as well. So all best wishes as you work through that. It's a tough environment, both politically as well as fiscally. Hopefully we can be helpful with helping you be creative, both in how you measure that progress and where you find new financial mechanisms. But thanks very much. It's been wonderful to have you.
All right, thank you.
So we'll see you on our next edition of Conversations at Global. Thanks everyone for joining us today. Signing off.